Rogue were the winningest team not to make it into Overwatch League Season 1, and therefore their roster disbanded, and anything that would resemble the core of this roster that had spanned back to playing in beta of Overwatch and was among possibly contending for the winningest roster in the West, did not feature in Overwatch League and doesn't and will not feature in the future. Um, so, inspired by Volumel's article series, Letters to a Future Fan, which I thought was a lovely poetic way of explaining history, explaining legend and mythology of these teams that people will look back on and say, who are the best teams, before the Overwatch League actually kicked off. Obviously, Rogue deserved to be in there, and I think it would be a travesty, to be honest, if they were forgotten to um, and as if the slate had been completely wiped clean and their achievements didn't matter whatsoever. So the era before the Overwatch League actually was pretty competitive. Started off in mid 2016, really, with the first LAN event, and uh, although there were few LANs in 2016 and 2017 before the Overwatch League kicked off, Rogue were one of the teams that started doing incredibly well right from the beginning, and although they had a shuffle of their roster at the beginning of 2017, as the first one started to dip slightly, the second one started with a bang as well, and the second iteration of their roster in early 2017 was one of the best teams in the world as well. And so there has been really no solid period of time where this roster has underachieved, except right towards the end, just before the Overwatch League was about to start. They are definitely the winningest team not to make it into the Overwatch League. They're one of the legends of the pre-Owl era, and so this is their story. This is their myth, their legend. If you haven't heard of the guys, this is a predominantly French team. They had a French core of players. They started with two Swedes on the roster as well, and depending on when you're watching this video, you may or may not remember, or some of these players might still be around and in different teams. Who knows? I'm not a prophet. They were definitely one of the two best Western teams throughout from before the Overwatch League Season 1 period, alongside Envious. And although there weren't really enough tournaments and LAN tournaments specifically to be able to develop a real rivalry between them, there was a little bit of a rivalry, certainly in terms of which could actually be called the best team in the Western region, best team in the world before 2017, really, when the Korean teams started to get enormously powerful. And in a sense, Thorin put out a tweet about this recently as well. We've been robbed a little bit of that rivalry because of the lack of LAN events that happened before the Overwatch League. And because Rogue is no longer, and Envious has carried through to be the Dallas Fuel, I suppose Envious won, in a sense. They managed to last them out and actually make it into the Overwatch League. No fault of the French players. So the other teams that came close to their level in the West were NIP, the Finnish team that went on to then become Giganti, and Misfits as well, whose core went on to become, well, whose core transitioned a couple of times and then went on to become the Florida Mayhem as well. But neither of those two teams were able to keep up in 2017 to the same degree. They were on a similar level with them towards the end of 2016, but weren't able to keep up. And it was only really Rogue and Envious, who were the two titans of the Western scene, that managed to go through this entirety of the pre-Owl period. Rogue were also the best team in the world in the summer and autumn of 2016, and proved it by winning and placing highly at a number of tournaments, basically every LAN tournament that was happening around then. And as I say, they shuffled their roster at the beginning of 2017, and they peaked again to become a top team in about the spring, was really when we saw that the kind of potential this team had. And they certainly weren't the best team in the world at that point. There was a lot more competition. The Korean teams had really started to become excellent as well. But they were one of the best teams in the world, and within the top 5 teams in the world at some period of time in the spring of 2017, but for a much shorter period of time than they had done with their previous roster in 2016. And they only really started going downhill towards the end in Contenders Season 1. They had some extraneous issues going on as well, to do with not getting into the Overwatch League and having to sort out visa situations and things like this. But we'll get onto that. To start back at the beginning of really when Rogue kicked off, Overwatch League before the Overwatch League really started properly when we went to the Hero Limit 1 rule set, which I think was somewhere, I think it was something like April or May 2016. Uh, it had been played before that for a number of months, but very messy meta, lots of crazy cheese strats and stuff like that. So I like to look at the history from the Hero Limit 1, and that's really when we started having the big lands as well. And the creation of this team with its real French core happened just after they won the tiny little land. I think it was the first land that ever happened in Overwatch, called Takeover. A very casual affair in Germany. At that point, they had 3 Swedish guys and 3 French guys. And as they moved into Hero Limit 1, they removed IDDQD from the roster, or he stepped down, I can't remember which. And they brought in Nox. And this is when the team properly kicked off, because previously, obviously, they'd been around the top of the European scene. You'd have to be able to win a LAN event like that still had a couple of other decent teams in attendance. But this gearing up to the first large LAN, the Atlantic Showdown, was when they properly solidified their roster. The meta started to settle down as well with Hero Limit 1, and some proper narratives and storylines started coming out of the woodwork. So to explain the roster, the French core was with Nox, Wins, AKM, and Unco. And then they had Tvick and Reinforce on the team at that time as well. So they had 4 French players and 2 Swedish players, one of them being a DPS player, Tvick, who played alongside AKM. Reinforce was the other Swede, and he was on tank. Alongside Wins, the majority of the time was the one playing off tank. And then Nox on Lucio, with Unco on the flex support most of the time. And when they reshuffled in 2017, they made a full French team, and you could really see the core of the players transition on. But at this time, it was a bit of a split with 4 French players, 2 Swedish players, but they certainly made it work. And something that's really carried on whenever you watch this team at a LAN event, particularly the French players, and we saw this in 2017 as well, a real measure of the team was the focus and determination that they had to be able to win events. Typically, people describe French teams in esports as being very emotional, very guided by their passions. They have cliques and certain people they don't get along with, so they don't want to form teams with them. Occasionally, that can hamper the potential of the French scene. But Rogue were really the creme de la creme of the French players that were around at the time, and they all got along, but it didn't ever seem so much like they were best friends. They were all united by an utter determination to be able to win, and a lot of them were former champions in other games as well. A few of them had come from Shootmania and Quake, where they'd had excellent careers already. Nox had come from TF2, where he'd been lauded as one of the best callers and players for many years as well. And the Quake and Shootmania guys all had incredible aim, and some of them went back onto the support, like Wins and Unco. Wins later transitioned over to support, and so they were willing to take the bullet for the team and hop onto something that didn't utilize their nuts aim so much, but would give the team the best chance of winning. And whenever you saw them play, they didn't get too hyped up about what was going on, very focused the entire time. Seemed to take things like practice and having the right headspace incredibly seriously, and they always expected greatness of themselves. They felt like to be a middling team, to be a mediocre team, was a waste of the talent, a waste of their potential. And so they always tried to achieve this spot of just being the best team and winning the tournament every time they could. In terms of the calling style of the team and the structure and how they actually set themselves up, a core that went through the entire iteration of Rogue was Wins as one of the main callers, the strats guy behind everything. Nox would call a little bit from his position on support, and then when he moved over to main tank, he used to offer little bits and pieces. Wins was kind of the focal guy that they all played around and came up with a lot of the big picture kind of plays. And then they also had a manager slash coach called Landfest, who also provided some of that tactical input. Rogue were innovators in a lot of different ways throughout their time together. Played in quite a different sense. Very aggressive team right from the beginning. Wins kind of pushed some very fundamental parts of playing Overwatch onto his team. Always forced them to play and die around the payload so that it wouldn't actually get advances even if they were losing the fight. Always had his teams push up further than himself while he was capping the cart to be able to gain better territory and be able to lock the enemy team out before they even came to contest so that the payload can carry on going. Little things like this were heavily prioritized by Rogue, and they certainly had a very aggressive nature, even early on when they were playing with Tweak and Reinforce. Reinforce was always known as one of the most aggressive tank players in the game, occasionally to his detriment, I think, because he would play a very self-sacrificial style to make a huge amount of space for the other very talented players on his team so that they could then clean up the rest of the fight after he'd already gone in and engaged. And he used to do the same kind of stuff, like when you see Winston's diving in on Reinhardt, he used to try and go for these crazy pins on... diving in on Winston. He used to go for these crazy pins on Reinhardt in kind of a similar way. That would just open up space or be able to get a single pin. He would trade his life for it, but he'd open up space for the rest of his team. So this was the kind of style of Rogue. We'll go into some famous compositions that they played and what they were running in the tournaments later, but this was the general ethos of Rogue, I think. But when they first began, obviously they had very strong online play to be able to qualify for all of these tournaments in the first place. Overwatch, back in the early days of summer 2016, very online game. There were pretty few LANs. The qualifiers are all online as well. And there were two major LAN events that dominated the summer of 2016. One of them was the ESL Atlantic Showdown, which pitted four American teams against four European teams against four North American teams in a tournament format. And then the other one was the Overwatch Open run by E-League, which had a big open qualifier circuit, as did the Atlantic Showdown. But once you're actually at the event, the two brackets of North America and Europe were separated, and only the winners met in the finals. Atlantic Showdown was first, but the qualifiers for the Overwatch Open were before that. Nox and team in Rogue qualified very early for the Overwatch Open, managed to beat two strong teams en route, Reunited, which were another top team at the time, and Creation, who were sat around second, third place in most people's standings at that point. And so this was an excellent performance from them. They'd managed to lock in their place in a major tournament. I think it was $300,000 at the time. And then they qualified for the Atlantic Showdown the very next day in another online qualifier. They lost 2-3 to Misfits, who were the other top European team. So there were four top European teams at the time that were pretty much head and shoulders above everybody else. Reunited, which then went on to be E-United later on, the same kind of core. Misfits, who, as I've said, later became the Florida Mayhem. And Creation Esports, who dropped off a cliff and ended up only just resurfacing almost 9 months later, I think, as a team called Dignitas, and then disbanded. And Rogue were able to get into these two LAN tournaments very early on, and then had about a month free where they didn't have to play any online qualifiers, where they could just grind for these two LAN events. So going into the Atlantic Showdown, people were less aware of what their power level was like, if you want to put it like that, because they had not been playing the online tournaments that a lot of other teams had to qualify for the event. And then there were seeding tournaments, and then also there was a cup called the Lenovo Cup that happened just before the large LAN event that a lot of teams played while they were at boot camp, because it was the first time that they'd had their teams actually together, and they wanted some tournament practice. So Rogue went in as a little bit of a dark horse. People knew that they were one of the top teams in Europe. They knew that Europe in general looked like it was favored over North America because of the historic online play that people had seen between them and the level of play just from watching the teams. But Rogue came up with a fantastic result in this tournament and really solidified their place on the world stage just with their results in this tournament. So they managed to go into it, and they were in a group with Cloud9, Reunited, and Complexity. Complexity, a kind of a lower level team in North America, obviously still somewhere within the top 5 or 6. They managed to qualify top 4 and get to this event. Cloud9 were second in North America at the time, but still judged to be a little underneath the European teams. Reunited were actually judged to be better than Rogue at the time, So they were expected to come out somewhere in second place, depending on how the Europe v North America matchup came up. They beat Cloud9 in the first match 2-1. It was a close game, but they managed to come out on top. And then they actually lost to Reunited. They won a map, they drew a map, and then they lost 2 maps. They lost 1 tiebreaker and lost another map. And so people's expectations so far were kind of, okay, so the European teams still look like they're a little bit better than the North American teams, but Reunited still on top for the moment. Rogue went through big complexity and got their place in the playoffs. And this is really where they solidified their spot in managed to get a fan base, managed to solidify their place on top of most people's standings in the world, because they beat Envious in the semi-finals 3-2. And to put that into perspective, Envious were an incredibly strong team in Europe, had pretty much been beating everybody, even the really strong top 4 European teams, but only for a very brief amount of time, about 6 months before this event happened. Then they moved to North America and spent a number of months, a long time over there, and basically wailed on all of the North American teams. They were on a 57-0 win streak, that's match or series win streak, against the North American teams since June the 11th. And the context of this streak is very different to some others you might get in esports. For example, if someone went on a 57-0 streak in the Overwatch League, that would be bananas. They're playing at LAN, they're playing against the highest caliber competition. They must be unreal to be able to keep that up. But for Envious, it was slightly different. All of these games were online because this was the first major LAN event that they'd played at. And it was in the kind of era of Overwatch where there was a lot of open qualifier competitions. So you'd be seeded into an enormous, like, 128 team bracket, and you'd have to beat 5 really crap teams to be able to get to the good teams. And at that point, they were still managing to beat the other good teams in North America, but a huge portion of those 57 wins were against teams that they probably shouldn't have been in tournaments with them if there'd been any kind of seeding. It was just that they had to go through open qualifier competition. Nevertheless, it was an incredibly consistent run, and they were the favorites coming into this because they'd already managed to beat the European teams back when they played in Europe, even though it was a long time ago. And so people really thought that Envious were going to be on top of this one and were the heavy favorites coming into it. Rogue managed to beat Envious 3-2 in an unbelievable series, made even more special by the fact that the Atlantic Showdown featured pick and ban on the maps, and we got to see Rogue unveil a lot of pocket strats, picking Hanamura, picking Temple of Anubis into Envious, bossing them on both assault maps, showing some really innovative stuff for the time, playing really close to the choke point on Hanamura with Mei, which had never been seen before. That was kind of a strategy that nobody had gone with before. Can't exactly remember what they did on Temple of Anubis, but that in itself was like they were pulling out pocket strats and pushing Envious to places that they weren't comfortable, and then managed to win the control map in the 5th tiebreaker map between the 2 teams, and knocked Envious out of the tournament, knocked the tournament favorites out. After a 57 win streak, they were their first loss. And Rogue ended up being able to go on to the finals and have a rematch against Reunited and beat them 3-1. So not only did they beat the 2 best teams in Europe and North America, or what people thought were the 2 best teams in Europe and North America. Envious definitely was, but Reunited, it was a little more questionable. They beat both the top North American team, the top European team had a lot of strong challenges along the way and edged it out in close matches, but they had proven that they could beat everybody in the Western world at this time, and this was really before the Korean teams were on the same kind of page. They hadn't had large tournaments to really be able to show off their skill level, and when they did match up against Western teams, they lost the first couple of interactions. So at this point, it would be reasonable to think that Rogue were certainly one of the best teams in the world. And because this was only our first piece of data, you could make a case to say that they were the best team in the world. But Reunited, Envious, these other kind of teams were still certainly up there with them. They went into the Overwatch Open after that pretty much as one of the favorites because of their performance in the Atlantic Showdown about a month beforehand. But there had been a bit of a meta shift. Triple tank had started coming into the meta. Ninjas in Pajamas, this incredible Finnish team, had come up with an amazing strategy that people were really struggling to beat. Teams like Rogue, teams like Misfits, teams like Creation had all really struggled to Reunited as well, had all really struggled to beat this Finnish tank composition. And so the Overwatch Open was less about can anyone beat Rogue, or rather can Rogue replicate their performance and win 2 LANs in a row. And it was more about can anyone beat NIP, because they'd had such unbelievable dominance coming into this LAN tournament. In terms of Rogue, they went into the groups against Anox, a Russian team, and then Misfits, another one of the top European teams. They beat both of those teams 2-0 to qualify for the playoffs. They were looking dead ahead to replicate their performance, or even possibly improve on it from the Atlantic Showdown. Then they played FaZe, who had Shadowburn, Fact Fiction, Too Easy. FaZe went 2-0 up against Rogue in a best of 5, and Rogue had to reverse sweep the match to be able to win against them. And FaZe were playing very aggressive, putting a lot of resources on Shadowburn's Genji, and Rogue had to take it back to tank compositions and more tank-favored maps, using Reinforce's Reinhardt to really be able to stop that. Ended up being able to beat them on Eichenwald, went through to the next stage of the playoffs, into what was the finals of the European side of the bracket. And they met Misfits, who'd beaten Ninjas in Pajamas earlier, and were running a May Reaper composition that ended up dominating the meta after this tournament. And Rogue were running a similar kind of thing against them. It was a bit of a mirror matchup between them. Both teams had incredible players, and this was another fantastic match. You need to go back and watch the Rogue versus Envious game at the Atlantic Showdown, and Rogue against Misfits at the Overwatch Open, because this really was a fantastic performance from Rogue, but it was Misfits showing that they had complete control of this meta and knew exactly how to play it, and it was a miracle run through the tournament. So Misfits went up 2-1, Rogue managed to bring it back to 2-2, and they went to a Hollywood game where people still have memories of AKM on Reaper getting slept off the top of one of the houses and unable to actually follow up on a Beyblade. I think he was slept with a nano boost on him or something. Just completely got crushed in this final fight on Hollywood. And Rogue and Misfits, managed to take and knock them out. But then Misfits went on against Envious in the grand final. It was supposed to be a European against North American final. And Misfits won the tournament 3-1 against Envious, made it look a lot easier than their games against Rogue and against Ninjas in Pajamas, leading many people to believe that if Rogue had been able to clutch that out in the final moments, they would have been favored against Envious again and possibly been able to repeat. And because the two brackets were so different, Envious had kind of got a pass to the finals because they'd only had to play against really quite a lot weaker North American teams. And the European side of the bracket was incredibly stacked. So for Rogue, they were certainly a top 3 team in that tournament, if not top 2 because of the weird format. So having won the Atlantic Showdown and then showed up so massively at the Overwatch Open, it now became very reasonable to call them the best team in the world, even though they had lost in such narrow fashion to Misfits and actually finished in something like 3rd/4th place officially because of the wonky playoff situation. Because of their performances at the 2 major LANs, the first 2 properly big international LANs in Overwatch, it was reasonable to call them the best team in the world. Misfits had this miracle run to the final. Envious had underperformed in 2 big tournaments where they were favored to take it. And so it was actually Rogue that did look like not just a very consistent team, but an excellent team that at their peak would also be able to beat everybody. And so they were invited to APAC Premier, a tournament in China in the autumn of 2016, kind of summer autumn. I think it was in October time, where the 2 of the best Korean teams were invited. 2, I was going to say of the best, but there's actually just 2 North American teams because the other one was NRG. 2 Western teams, because the other one was NRG. But it was the best teams from China, 2 of the best teams from Korea, and Rogue. And that was also a fantastic tournament because this is really where we saw the first Korean teams on the main stage. We'd only seen them inside of their own bubble up until then, and we got to see what kind of damage they could do. People knew that Korea were going to be a threat. They didn't know whether they would quite be able to match up to the Western teams. And the Chinese teams were expected to be worse than the other regions. Rogue were put in a group with Lunatic High, whose core went on to form Seoul Dynasty in the Overwatch League. Two-time back-to-back Apex winners as well later on. And Lunatic High beat Rogue twice in the group stage. The group stage was super wonky. It was like GSL, but the two teams that qualified played a match anyway to decide seeding or something. So Rogue and Lunatic High actually matched up first in the group stage, and Lunatic High got the better of them. Coming out with a big performance on Route 66. It was pretty close across the series, but Route 66, they kind of dominated Rogue. I don't think they were really ready for how they were playing. And then they played this weird seeding game afterwards where Lunatic High already had a one-map advantage and then got to pick the other map, so just picked Route 66 again and beat them again. So that second series doesn't really make sense. I don't count it personally, or at least I only count it as one map win rather than a series win. But officially, Lunatic High beat Rogue twice in the group stage. Rogue still made it through to the playoffs. And there they faced a bracket that saw them come up against Africa Freaks Blue, along with some of the top Chinese teams, and then Lunatic High. And at this point, there was little coverage of the Korean tournaments, and Apex hadn't kicked off properly. So most of the top teams in Korea were unknowns, apart from Luxury Watch Red, who kind of had an aura around them for having such incredible DPS players. Lunatic High were well respected for winning on placing highly in a number of online tournaments and some small LAN events as well, I think. And Africa Freaks Blue had also done similar. So these were the three big teams that people from the West were aware of. Two of them in this tournament, and Rogue had to face them both and had to face Lunatic High twice if they wanted to make it through and actually win the event. And Rogue at this point were playing phenomenally. They had proven an ability to adapt. And they went into the playoffs, 3-1'd Africa Freaks Blue, who were also an excellent team, and just straight knocked them out in the quarterfinals because that's where they ended up matching up against them, and had a really great performance against them. Then they went on to go through the best Chinese team at the time, which was called NGA Titan, and beat them, just destroyed them 3-0. And then went through to the grand finals where Lunatic High had been able to get through and had fantastic adaptation to be able to defeat them. They won 4-1, and the one map that they lost was a replay of Numbani after they'd drawn. So they drew on Numbani, then they replayed it, then Lunatic High won. And Rogue won all the other 4 maps that they played. And they were bossing them. At this point, it was like they had lost to them in the group stage, identified how they played, knew how to react to it, and knew exactly what Lunatic High were going to throw at them, and flexed onto a range of strategies so perfectly. And this tournament, APAC Premier, is really where people began to say that Tweak was the best player in the world. Or at least, not so much began to say it, because he'd had this aura around him right from the Atlantic Showdown, but and also way back to beta, actually. He was fantastic online. But here at this tournament, he was moving on to such a huge range of heroes, picking up Hanzo and combining the ults so perfectly, coming off at crazy angles and flanking people with his Dragon Strike. He had some amazing switches on King's Road. They played against them, and they knew exactly that that a Pharaoh would be perfect in a certain position. Again, Tvik just hops onto it and destroys. They hop onto McCree to counter the enemy Pharaoh when it gets to the same point and they're on defense. This was a fantastic flex performance by Tvik, and part of the reason that they're able to roll through Lunatic High so well is because Tvik had a mastery on a huge range of flex DPS heroes that allowed them to run all of these different strategies, and Lunatic High couldn't keep up. They were just getting steamrolled backwards. So fantastic performance by them. They won Atlantic Showdown. They finished second in the European portion of the Overwatch Open, and then they won APAC Premier. So at this point, you had to say that Rogue were the best team in the world. They were looking fantastic. They'd beaten the 2 best Korean teams They'd beaten the best North American team. And then they'd also beaten a huge bunch of European teams. This was Rogue's period. It certainly was. They certainly were the best team in the world. They looked fantastic. They had a mastery of the meta. They had a huge range of very talented players. And they looked fairly unstoppable. They were invited back to Korea, or rather, not back to Korea. This was their first time going to Korea, but back to face some Korean teams, including Lunatic High and Afrika Freaks Blue, in Apex Season 1, the first season of Apex, which became the premier tournament in the period before the Overwatch League. At this point, as I say, they were definitely the best team in the world, and they were at this point expected to perform. So where it had been a bit of a question mark beforehand, like, oh, we don't know how they're going to match up against Envious. Now we don't know how they're going to match up against Ninjas in Pajamas, Misfits, and Envious at the Overwatch Open. Now we don't know how they're going to match up against the top Korean teams. At this point, Rogue had proven that they could face any of these teams and be able to beat them if they were having a good day, and be able to crush them if they were having a good day, in fact. And so when they went into Apex Season 1, they were one of the favorites, and probably the favorite to win the tournament. The meta was also perfect for them. They went undefeated in the groups and 3-0'd Afrika Freaks Blue, who were in there with them, knocked them into second seed for the tournament. And Envious, the other Western team or rather the other very strong Western team that was invited to Apex Season 1, lost to Lunatic High in the group, so Envious was second seed as well. And this is incredibly important for how the playoffs actually happened, and really how the whole era of Rogue versus Envious, and the glory of Envious, and the accolades that they have. This is really where it all started, is Apex Season 1 and the weird situation in the playoffs. So again, Rogue defeats Afrika Freaks Blue, one of the best Korean teams, 3-0s them, utterly dismisses them, puts them into second seed. Envious are in another group. They lose to Lunatic High. They look like it was a close game. They were kind of on even footing, but maybe slightly below the Koreans in the Beyblade May kind of meta. And the way that Apex playoffs works is that all of the first seeds from the groups can pick the second seed from another group or from their own group to play them in the playoffs. And so they could have picked Afrika Freaks Blue. They also could have picked Reunited, who didn't have, who had a stand-in, and they looked like they were in shocking form, to be honest. They could have picked BK Stars, who were like a pretty decent, but only just above, just kind of above average Korean team. Or they could have picked Afrika Freaks, who they absolutely dunked on in the groups. They could have picked any of these teams, but they didn't. They picked Envy because Envious at that point had lost Tailspin, one of their DPS players, their flex DPS player, and Rogue thought that they would be able to knock out a really strong opponent straight at the beginning of the playoffs before they had any time to adapt. The other reason that this is so important, Apex Season 1, is because this is when a new patch happened. Between the groups and the playoffs, a patch happened that is honestly the biggest meta-shifting patch that I think we've ever seen. Like, one single patch shifted the meta massively here, in the Hero Limit 1 era. So they'd gone from playing what the people call the Beyblade meta, where it was May and Reaper. Anna was incredibly strong, able to do a ton of healing, ults charged really fast. And they tweaked a huge amount of stuff, and basically the default composition after that was instead of playing 2-2-2 with either a May Reaper or two hit scan heroes or a Genji McCree or something, and playing a huge amount of Ryan Anna with Zarya, it instead went to a Diva triple tank patch with Soldier 76. So you would have one Soldier 76 player, a Reinhardt, a Diva, a Roadhog, an Anna, and a Lucio, and you had a couple of different variations on that. Some teams would drop one support and go over to the and add a Winston into it and something like this. But in general, it was a massive patch change, and Rogue wanted to knock out Envious, one of their main opponents. Like, this was by far and away the strongest of the second seeds, but they thought that they could knock them out really early on, before Envious had time to adapt, recover, and pose a challenge to them later on in the playoffs. So really, it kind of makes sense, right? It's a solid strategy. If you know that one of your opponents, one of your big rivals, is going through some problems, they're going through a roster change, they have to scramble to find someone who wasn't involved in the tournament and can actually fly over to Korea and play for them. And there's been a big patch change, so they're going to have to adapt on top of that. Come on, Rogue should have had this in the bag, surely. What actually happened was Envious went on an unbelievable miracle run, found this guy Mickey, who just grinded D.Va all day long and turned out to be fantastic at it. Their teamwork was unbelievable. They flexed Harry Hook over to Soldier 76, where he was godlike, and he'd been previously playing on Lucio. And they had this insane run of a little bit luck because of how the patch hit them, a little bit just working on their incredible skill and talent. They mentally were doing so well. Taimu was playing an unbelievable Roadhog as well. And Rogue ended up losing 2-3 to Envious, who ended up winning the tournament. So there are many different worlds in which Apex Season 1 goes a completely different way. There's a world in which Envious lose to Kongdu Uncia, and actually a Western team has never won Apex. There's a world in which the patch doesn't hit at that point, or a tournament client was out or something, and Rogue end up playing on that patch, which they were certainly the best team in the world at, and end up winning Apex Season 1, as it looked like the whole way up to the playoffs, before this major patch hit and kind of screwed everything up and flipped it all on its head. And of course, there are many worlds in which Envious managed to win in even better form. You know, you can't just say that all the alternate universes have Envious losing. Perhaps they would have won even more, because they were a phenomenal team at the time and built on their core of incredible teamwork and being a top 5 team in the world, probably. No, definitely a top 5 team in the world coming into the playoffs. But this patch elevated them to the #1 team in the world. And so after Apex Season 1, I think there was a feeling in the team that they'd been robbed of the largest tournament victory before the Overwatch League. And all this time on the road, in China at APAC Premier, in Korea in Apex Season 1, had taken its toll on the team. Instead, I think as well, something had been brewing below the surface for quite a long time with the 4 French players and 2 Swedish players. I think they'd developed into 2 different cliques. There was a language barrier between them as well, where I think they would converse within themselves. Like the French players would converse within French to themselves, and the Swedish players would feel left out and then maybe chat to themselves in Swedish. And I think the entire atmosphere of being on the road for so long and having these 2 cliques ended up creating dispute between the 2 halves of the team. And they were internally sick of each other. There were disputes between the 2 halves. And so the team decided to split up. I think, in fact, they were even going to split up before Apex or something. Or maybe even before APAC, actually. I remember talking to one of the team about this. Anyway, they didn't, and they stuck together and won APAC and made the playoffs of Apex Season 1. But they did split after this. So they split into essentially their 2 halves. The 4 French players decided to make a full French team, and the 2 Swedish players decided to make a full Swedish team. In what was called the triple shuffle between Rogue, which had previously been an incredible team, Misfits, who had won the Overwatch Open, and then had also won DreamHack Winter as well, actually, and were another incredible European team, and a team called LG, who just had a lot of good players, but had never really had any good results. So Rogue sent Vic and Reinforce over to Misfits, where they made the full Swedish team, and they got a direct trade of Soon, who was this incredibly good Tracer and McCree and Reaper player from Misfits, also French, and Skipjack, who was their tank. So they trade out a DPS and a tank. They get a DPS and a tank in, but Skipjack was actually German. So although the team wanted to converse in French, Skipjack had to kind of learn French on the fly. I'm really not sure why they ended up picking Skipjack up as well, because they got rid of him very shortly after. But this is the shuffle that Rogue went through right at the end of 2016. They played one more tournament before 2017 called IEM Gyeonggi, which was a Korean kind of standalone tournament that happened over the course of 2 days. I think it was December the 18th and 19th, I believe. And this was very shortly after the teams had gone through this shuffle, and they got invited up along with Misfits as well, I believe. So there was a weird seeding system in this tournament where you had, what did you have? You had 6 teams, but they started with essentially quarterfinals, but with only 4 teams playing, and then they added the semi-finalists to the winners of that. So they essentially gave 2 teams a bye to the semi-finals, and Rogue were one of those teams. But this was straight after the shuffle. They really hadn't had that much time to settle on what their style would be. Skipjack was a much more passive tank player than Reinforce was, and soon couldn't play the huge range of heroes to the same kind of level that Tweak could. He was much more of a hit scan specialist in a similar way to AKM was, but slight differences in terms of their hero pool and a bit more flexibility. But this weird seeding system saw them enter in the semi-finals, and they lost the only game that they played, but it was to LW Red, who ended up winning the tournament. And to be fair, they lost 1-3, and LW Red only dropped 2 maps the entire time. So they did as well as anybody did against LW Red, but it didn't give us any kind of flavor of how this team was going to play, to be honest. They were playing triple tank and quad tank. They tried to play some triple DPS with Soon on Genji and AKM on Tracer, which was very strange. Neither of them really playing heroes that they're known for. And then they were playing it against an incredible team that was really well coordinated and had a superstar player in Flower at the time. So I Am Kangi was a disappointment for them and was their first tournament with this new roster, this new experiment with the full French in quotation marks, because they had German Skipjack. And so they took some time off again to reboot the roster and really try for something excellent. Again, this was a team where they weren't happy with a roster that was going to underperform. They expected greatness of themselves, and they were going to work on the roster until they got greatness. So what happened was they got rid of Skipjack, who was German and couldn't speak French that well, and was a little bit of an inflexible tank player as well, very passive, didn't quite fit their style. And they created the French team of Rogue that was dominant throughout the beginning of 2017 and known for pioneering and playing incredibly well this triple DPS style. They picked up a guy called Nico for his Genji and Diva play. They moved Nox, who had been playing on Lucio, to main tank, where he played predominantly Winston. And then they moved Wins, who had been playing Zarya mainly up to this point, Zarya and like Soldier 76 and stuff like this, over to Lucio. So they still had their 2 callers on like a tanky position, and then the main caller now on Lucio. And they had 3 players that could all play DPS to a very high level. Soon was well known for being a star Tracer and McCree player, and Reaper as well, actually. AKM was well known for being an incredibly good McCree player, an incredibly good Soldier 76 player, and a very good Reaper player. And Nico was picked up really for his Genji. So they pioneered, I don't think they actually came up with it, but they certainly found that it worked for them, and they spread the trend throughout Europe. People didn't really understand why they made this move until they saw the team play, because on paper it didn't make much sense. Nox had never played a main tank before. There were a lot of question marks about that. People had predominantly been playing 2-2-2, and so they didn't really understand who would be playing the second tank now that Wins was on Lucio. They thought that may be up to Nico. And then when we saw them play the triple DPS, it was obvious that they were just going to turn this aggressive, skill-centric style that they'd had, that they'd always had kind of lurking in the background. They were just going to turn it up to 11 and go wild with it. They moved to North America pretty much before playing any tournament in Europe with this new style, with this new lineup, and they dominated the online tournaments. They were, it was a much more competitive era than when Envious had their run. There were better teams over in North America. They weren't playing open qualifiers, but they were still playing online. But they dominated. They went unbeaten for a huge amount of time. They had a very fierce rivalry with a team called Selfless, who themselves played a very unique style. A lot of the North American teams were still playing a lot of Reinhardt and playing around their tanks. And Rogue just chewed them up with this triple DPS style, incredibly aggressive. They beat Immortals every time that they'd come up against them, the team whose core later on went on to be LA Valiant. And they beat Envious twice in the only times that they'd played against them. But that was before Envious ended up getting effect. They were playing with Louis, and they were significantly weaker than when they went into Apex Season 3. But this was the beginning of a crazy dominant period by Rogue, and they looked like one of the best teams in the world. It was difficult to tell because they hadn't played any LANs with the new team, and North America still wasn't the most competitive region in the world. Envious had been over playing in Apex, and so they hadn't had too many games against them. A lot of the strong teams were still over in Europe as well. And so there was a strange period of time where, yes, Rogue were incredibly dominant and looked like they were a superb team, but they didn't get too much of a chance to prove it until they were invited to Apex Season 3. And Apex Season 3 was their chance to prove that they were not just an incredible team that could be dominant within North America, they could be dominant on a world level. At this point, the Koreans were definitely considered the best teams in the world. Lunatic High had beaten Runaway in Apex Season 2 to become the best team in the world, although I think they'd already been ranked the best team in the world a little bit before that because of their performances in other tournaments as well. And so when Apex Season 3 started, it was obvious right from the beginning that Rogue had been seeded into a mad and absolutely ridiculous group. Rogue were considered a top 5 team in the world coming into the tournament, and people had high hopes that they would be able to progress to potentially even win it if they either got lucky or the Koreans weren't able to handle their super aggressive style, or they had a nice playoff run or something and just hit an incredible level of form. But as soon as you looked at the group, it was bananas, because Rogue were in their top 5 team in the world with Lunatic High, who were the best team in the world, and Kongdu Panthera, who, after retooling their roster a little bit, looked to be top 3 in the world as well. So you had this, and they were in there with Mighty AOD, who were probably a top 15, at worst a top 20 team in the world as well. So this was by far the biggest group of death we've ever had in Overwatch, and it made for some fantastic games, but unfortunately cut Rogue very early off from any kind of run in Apex Season 3. Rogue came into Korea playing triple DPS when all of the Korean teams were playing Winston, D.Va, dive compositions, and although Rogue were reportedly winning all of their scrims when they first arrived, the Korean teams were very quick to adapt. And this Winston D.Va style, particularly the D.Va with its old defense matrix, which could be held up for, I think it was 4 seconds, was an incredibly good counter to the triple DPS style, because when everybody from Rogue engaged onto teams, they would be able to turn around, use the defense matrix to protect the person that was being attacked, and at that point set the rest of their team up in a good position to be able to collapse on them or get picks from the squishier targets that had already committed themselves in. So if Rogue weren't able to get off the picks or weren't able to execute lightning fast so that the D.Va wasn't there to protect them, or they weren't able to juggle the D.Va away and waste her defense matrix somewhere else before they struck, the Korean teams were able to get the better end of the fights against Rogue. Rogue partially blamed the conditions there as well, and stuff like playing in a hotel for ages apparently didn't suit them particularly nicely. They didn't really enjoy their time playing in Korea in Apex Season 3, probably also because they weren't winning as much. These guys are 100% set on winning all the time, and I can definitely imagine that having worse performances and seeing yourself slowly slip in comparison to how the Korean teams are playing when you came with such high hopes would be devastating for such a group of motivated individuals. But the Korean teams definitely learned and adapted, and by the time Apex Season 3 actually started and they'd had a bit of a boot camp beforehand, the Koreans had proven that they were the best at adapting, the best region at adapting, and certainly the best teams at adapting, and Rogue were not crushed, they were crushed on paper, but when you look at the games, they were still very close, and the fights were all incredibly close. But the Koreans consistently got the better hand of them. Rogue were able to beat Mighty AOD, although they dropped Temple of Anubis, but still beat them 3-1, and looked relatively decent. They played against Kongdu Panthera, and it was basically a must-win game. They had to beat Kongdu Panthera, otherwise they were in a crazy situation where they had to beat Lunatic High, and then also Kongdu Panthera had to lose to somebody else. So they basically had this like playoff game to make it to the playoffs against Kongdu Panthera. They genuinely could have gone 3-0 up in this series and beaten Kongdu Panthera and looked fantastic, but in the end they lost 1-3. The map that they won was pretty good, pretty dominant, but they let the control map slip away through their fingers when they were at 99%, 1-0 up on Oasis. And then the next map that they lost as well, again, tiny little advantages that Rogue threw away, whereas Panthera were consistently clutching every time. So it's not that you can say Rogue were unlucky or certainly should have won that game or should have won that game or something. But the two teams were incredibly close. And when Rogue started making the minor mistakes, Panthera were always there to clutch, to take advantage of the weaknesses. And so these minor little errors in Rogue's gameplay and the little peaks in Panthera's overlapped to give Panthera the consistently better results in the map and ended up winning the series 3-1. And then Rogue, although it was theoretically possible for them to win, they would have had to beat Lunatic High something like, I think it was, they had to beat them at least 3-1, and Kongdu Panthera had to have a poor performance against Mighty AOD or something. It seemed almost impossible. Rogue went into the Lunatic High game, potentially with their head not in a great space, who knows. They played close maps against Lunatic High, but they lost 0-3, and Lunatic High consistently looked like the better team. And so Rogue were eliminated from Apex Season 3 when they come in as a top 5 team with such high hopes, having been dominant in North America, and were really the hope of the West for another Apex victory, even though Envious was also in that season. It was all the focus was really on Rogue because of how well they'd been performing. And what this really showed was that Rogue were having struggles with adaptability. They weren't really able to adapt. They were playing one style. It was red. They didn't have too much to go for. The roster that they'd created that could play this triple DPS style so well was struggling because the heroes that they needed to flex to weren't really in the players' wheelhouses. And so they were a team that was only going to be good if the style that they played was in vogue, and if the enemy team read them and had the same kind of individual level to keep up, Rogue were going to be in a bad place. Having said that, they came back to Europe and played in a LAN called Takeover 2 and absolutely slaughtered everybody. So they still showed that they were head and shoulders above pretty much everybody in North America and Europe, with the possible exception of Envious once they got Effect. But Rogue was not at the same level as the top Korean teams in the world. When they came back after Korea and played in Takeover 2, this was some of the most coordinated Overwatch that I've ever seen from a triple DPS team. And a lot of the European teams, pretty much all of them, were playing triple DPS at the time, trying to emulate Rogue style or putting a little twist on it, playing it in more of a reactive way or a slightly more passive way. But Rogue absolutely dominated them. This time in Korea seemed to have improved them, even though they felt like they were slipping. I think it was just that the other Korean teams were steadily improving and also reacting to Rogue's style. Rogue still seemed to be improving. Their performance at Takeover 2 was better than their online performances against the North American teams. They destroyed all the other triple DPS teams. People thought that E-United would be on their level or Movistar Riders would be on their level. They beat E-United 3 times, 3-1, 3-0, 3-1. And E-United didn't drop a map to anybody apart from Rogue. So this was like, E-United were head and shoulders above everybody else in Europe. And then Rogue were head and shoulders above them as well, like clearly on top of the pack. So there was no better representative that the West could have sent other than Rogue and Envious. And the fact that both of them had underwhelming performances in Apex Season 2 clearly showed that the Korean teams was on a different level. But they came back and they won a title here. They won a LAN title with this full French roster at TakeOver 2 against good competition, strong European teams that were probably on a similar level to the North American teams at the time, maybe slightly higher in general, but only very marginal, nothing like it was in 2016. The North American teams have got significantly better, and teams like Selfless were coming out and showing that North America did have some good teams in the region, other than just Envious, who are really European anyway. But the performance at Apex Season 3 and then the performance at TakeOver, where they were so contrasted between the results that they got, really showcased the weaknesses and strengths of the new Rogue team. Whereas the old Rogue team had an ability to adapt and flex to the style that was on show and had a really good understanding of the meta and what their opponents were going to throw at them, this new French Rogue was focused on incredible individual skill, trying to coordinate their dives as well as they possibly could, but were very inflexible and very weak at adaptation. They were stuck because their players' hero pools overlapped so much, so that they didn't have many players who could really specialize in different roles and bring different stuff to the team. They didn't really have a dedicated off tank who could play that kind of flex role for them. Instead, they had 3 DPS players that all had a different niche. So they had 1 Genji player, 1 Soldier 76 player, 1 Tracer player. None of the other DPS players could really play Tracer as well as Soon. Certainly neither of them could play Soldier 76 as well as AKM, and neither of the French, neither AKM nor Soon could play Genji anywhere near as well as Nico. So if they wanted to use any one of those 3 heroes, they were kind of pigeonholed into using the guy that they had picked up to use it. So it made their roster very inflexible, and works perfectly if you can use all 3 of them in a triple DPS style, and they certainly pushed that meta and pushed that comp as far as they could possibly take it. But in the end, they were too inflexible to be able to win these huge titles, the Apex titles. And the team never really learnt the best way to play Winston D.Va and be able to play a bit more of a controlled or disengaged style. They had a bit of a squishy, aggressive backline that really liked to get up in people's faces and made them vulnerable to being dived on. They were very much an all-in, very aggressive team. And so they had an exploitable style, whereas the previous Rogue with the Swedes had been much more of a well-rounded team, I think. Even if it had lacked some of the real explosive power that Soon added to the roster. And Nox on tank as well, actually, because Nox was fantastic. But again, quite an aggressive player. At this point, they went back to North America, and this is the point at which they started really to decline a little bit. They played a tournament called the Beat Invitational, another online tournament. Had a very close series against a team called Arc 6, who had XQC, Dante, Space. Some good players, just up and coming at the time, who never really should have been close to knocking Rogue out of a tournament, but, or rather, not knocking them out, but actually just beating them. Because at this point, Rogue was still on a crazy win streak. They'd won something like 37 matches in a row in the West and only lost those 2 games in Korea. So they'd still never lost with this roster to a Western team. But they had a very close series against Arc 6, this kind of up-and-coming, just breaking into the top 10 in the world, maybe more like a top 15 team in the world. But Arc 6 really performed very well. This was kind of the time where Rogue was starting to slip a little bit, or not take it as seriously, who knows. And then they played against Immortals and had some crazy series against them where it was very close. Immortals had just got Kareev and Fate into the lineup, 2 Korean players, playing a style that focused on taking the D.Va out of the situation. Rogue at this point had switched from their triple DPS to playing a D.Va Winston style, and this D.Va was causing them issues. They didn't really know how to integrate it into the lineup properly. And so even though they won that tournament, they certainly showed that they were not dominant anymore. And even if they were winning the matches, the gods were bleeding and had shown that you could draw blood from them. They went into Contenders Season 1, and this is by far the worst tournament that Rogue has ever had. Envious was back in the country, back in North America. Both teams were playing in this. It had a large prize pool. I think it was $100,000. It was all online, but with LAN playoffs. So there was a point where you could have really closed out the pre-Owl era with this big matchup between the two rivals of 2016 and early 2017, Envious against Rogue. And this was the entire storyline of the North American one. Because Rogue still looked like they were pretty good. They just won an event, a takeover, albeit playing triple DPS. Now they were trying to play Winston D.Va. And Envious were back in the country, having added effect to their roster, looking fantastic, added Kai as a coach, and they looked like they were a much more well-rounded team, possibly one of the best. And so this was the real rivalry back on the cards, but Rogue were just plagued with issues. They couldn't get their visas in time, so they're forced to play from Canada on some laptops. And after going 44 wins in a row, 44 match wins in a row, unbeaten with this roster against any Western team, they lost to Envision. This team that had come out from nowhere had literally bought their spot in Contenders Season 1 after failing to qualify. And this was their first ever loss in the West, was to this scrub roster with some up-and-coming players for sure, like some decent teams, but nobody that you'd really consider Overwatch League quality, apart from possibly Jaru, their Genji. And so this was an unbelievable surprise. Even considering that Rogue were playing from Canada on some gaming laptops or whatever, people were still shocked by this. And the Contenders Season 1 continued to go badly for Rogue. Some of the other North American teams had improved, so they couldn't coast as much. They couldn't play this triple DPS style that had been working so well for them. They were really struggling. They lost to FNRGFE 2-3, another team that they really should have beaten. Even if it had been close with the team, you would have had them favored for that matchup. But Buds ended up wrecking AKM on Widowmaker towards Ruins in the tiebreaker to give them the win there. And then they played against FaZe, again in this dodgy laptop situation. FaZe were another up-and-coming team, probably top 3 in North America, you would say. Didn't win a map against them, lost 3 maps against them, and drew 1 of the maps. So this was poor performance coming out from Rogue here. But they had this this excuse of having to play from laptops in Canada. And as soon as they came back, they did improve, but it was way too late. They'd already played 3 of their opponents. There was only 2 more to play. One of them was Kungana, who were already out of the running anyway, and probably would have beaten them if they'd been playing on gaming laptops, because the team was absolutely collapsing. And the last game of the season was against Envious, who it would have been an incredibly tough opponent to face at the best of times. And they just got back. Now they felt like they were playing a little bit better. So they improved towards the end of the season, smashed Kungana, and they did have a very close game against Envious. They drew on Numbani, Rogue won Gibraltar, but they lost 2 maps and ended up losing the series and didn't make playoffs. Even though they definitely did look like a top 4 team, they ended up losing out because Envision had such a miracle run towards the beginning of the season, including beating Rogue. And FNRGFE actually pipped them to the post and made playoffs in the 4th position as well, above them. So even though Rogue looked like a top 3 team by the end of Contenders Season 1 in North America, possibly top 4 if you consider FN or GFE, but I think top 3, Rogue had such a horrible start to Contenders Season 1 that they didn't make playoffs and could never redeem themselves from what had been a shocking performance at the beginning of the season. And so their last real large event as Rogue, at the same time as people realized that they were missing out on the Overwatch League and hadn't managed to secure a spot or get in with their team or anything, was an underperformance and by far the worst placing that Rogue had in a tournament. They did get one last hurrah as Team France. It was the exact same lineup, went in as Team France, but it's the World Cup, you know, they weren't playing against incredible level teams. Who knows if they were even putting in their full effort. I think they probably were. I think they probably wanted to go out with a bang. They had a very close series against China, although the Chinese team was pretty weird. Both teams went to overtime on Numbani and Junkertown. To be fair to them, they gave the Korean World Cup team that ended up winning it the best series out of anybody, pushing them to the limits on the maps. They ended up losing 3-1, but they had very strong performances against the Korean team and made that series very enjoyable to watch. And then they played Sweden straight afterwards in the bronze match game and ended up flopping a little bit against Sweden. So they were unable to actually get third place in the World Cup as well. But again, it was just a World Cup. That was like this last hurrah of Rogue as we realized that they weren't going to get into the Overwatch League. And it really is a travesty that they weren't able to get into the Overwatch League, because as I've described, they were one of the winningest team. They were the second winningest team in the West, the second best team that the West has produced after Envious. And at times, as in throughout the summer and autumn of 2016, were better than Envious, and at the beginning of 2017 they were better than Envious as well. So this was a fantastic team, packed full of individual talent, that had two very different separate rosters, and both achieved greatness and unfortunately missed out on the Overwatch League. Now, according to statements from the players, this was because Rogue, the organization, told them they had a spot but actually didn't, and who knows what went on there. So nobody from teams that had spots realized that the Rogue players were available. The Rogue players themselves didn't realize that they were available and should have been looking for people. And then by the time they realized, they were kind of stuck because all the spots had been announced. A lot of these teams had already got rosters and hadn't even considered the Rogue players, despite the fact that they were some of the best players in the world. And everyone else had pretty much filled up their rosters. And Rogue were without a home in the Premier Tournament that was going to define accolades, the history books of Overwatch moving forwards. So a couple of their players took spots on what would be considered lower level teams relative to Rogue. For example, Sunanunko went to the Los Angeles Valiant in Overwatch League Season 1. To put this in perspective, this is a team that Sunanunko had beaten every single time they played against them. Every single time. They'd played against them and beaten them 3 times. They'd only actually faced Immortals 3 times, but they'd beaten them every time. And Immortals were much more of an up-and-coming team. They were only really relevant in 2017. In 2016, they were nobodies. And so Sunanunko kind of stepping down to their level to join a team to potentially boost the individual talent that's on there and give them some kind of top-level performance that they'd never been able to achieve before. But Sunanunko are the big guys moving onto that roster. AKM was just left as a free agent, floating around, trying to get in to different teams, despite the fact he'd been one of the best DPS players in the world for a huge amount of time, all throughout 2017 and a long time in 2016 as well. Wins was kind of floating around as well, the big brain behind Rogue that had led this team to such incredible victories in 2016 and had pioneered a style in 2017, was just left kind of floating around, either unable or unwilling to join lesser teams and carry on playing support or something. The guy's got phenomenal aim and was incredible in games like Quake as well. Went and played Quake Champions for a while. Possibly could have had a coaching spot on other teams as well, because he's, as I said, a very intelligent guy. Had always been coming up with the strats and been calling for Rogue as well. And then Nox and Nico, the 2 TF2 players that had joined Rogue, joined a French team called Eagles Gaming, which was basically the best of the French players that weren't Rogue at that point. And it really remains to be seen where these guys go, because as of recording, this is before Overwatch League Season 1 kicks off. We don't know if any of these players will ever replicate the same kind of performances they had on Rogue in 2016 or 2017. We don't know whether they're going to carry on being legends of the game, whether they're going to forge new legendary performances of their own, perhaps with LA Valiant. Whether Nox and Nico, with their strong individual performances on tank and kind of DPS respectively, or support and DPS even, and their brain behind the game, can elevate that team to be one of the best non-Overwatch League teams. We don't know what AKM and Wins, the 2 brothers of the team, are going to be doing. 2 of the best players on Rogue are just kind of left floating around. AKM's a great pickup for anybody halfway through the season. And so this was the legend of Rogue, the travesty that is probably the best team not to make it into the Overwatch League, or at least the winningest team not to make it into the Overwatch League, because you could make the argument that just before the Overwatch League kicked off, they weren't quite one of the top teams in the world anymore. But they were certainly one of the legendary teams of the pre-Owl era, and the roster, if anybody can be said to have deserved to make it into Overwatch League, I think they could. But it's not about that. It's that's where the cookie crumbles in the end. So this was The Legend of Rogue.